Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So I'm Stefan, and I'm very pleased that you've all joined us today for this session on advocacy. So in public affairs in Brussels and beyond, we've been saying for years that demonstrating public trust and support are prerequisites for success, especially as more issues become political. And yet, building public trust and support has usually been seen as somebody else's job, especially here in Brussels, let's be honest. But we don't have that luxury anymore. If we do not take an active role in building trust and support, assuming we deserve it, we will lose. While no tactic or tool alone can build trust, of course, technology can certainly help. It can help identify, engage, and mobilize the communities of support that are essential in building trust. None more so than NationBuilder, which has powered thousands of campaigns in politics and other fields for a long time. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Saoirse and Chris today. Over to you guys.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Chris Ricklin. I am the Director of Europe, Middle East and Africa for NationBuilder. So it is fantastic to be here today. I think I've met some of you in Brussels, but I haven't been for a while. I live in London, so I'm in our London office, and can't wait to get back there and start being on the road again. But we are here for now, so we can do what we do. So I've been at NationBuilder for about 6 years, and I've had numerous different roles, but I've always been involved in kind of the high level advocacy work in both DC, London, and Brussels. And so kind of how any kind of organizations, you know, whether that's political, NGOs, or companies or associations, kind of impact policy and legislation by using kind of campaign tactics. So that's my personal passion, is how technology scales that impact, and how anybody can take part in democracy in whatever way makes sense for the organization. So I'm really excited to be here and involved in the session and chat with Stefan a little bit at the end. And I'll kick it back to Saoirse, who's going to lead us through the content.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm Saoirse Rochford. As you can hear, I'm actually from the EU, but I'm based in Boston in our Boston office with NationBuilder. Previously to NationBuilder, I've been at NationBuilder for about 5 years. Similar to Chris, have worn many different hats. I currently run our partnerships program here, but previously I came from the public affairs world. So I've worked with a number of corporations, NGOs, with government bodies themselves on actually implementing digital infrastructure for whether it is communicating with voters, their stakeholders, or mapping out stakeholder engagement. So really excited to bring some of the NationBuilder expertise to you today. All right, so our agenda. We're going to touch on what corporate advocacy actually is. We're going to talk about 5 key strategies that we know that work, an actual advocacy campaign rollout, then going in specifically, what does pan-European engagement look like? And lastly, the role of crisis communications. So that's kind of going to be our content stream. We're then going to jump into a fireside chat between Chris and Stefan before we go into the Q&A. So, NationBuilder, who are we? We are leadership software. In our software, you have the ability to create a website, engage with your data through our CRM, and broadcast to your community via email and text. We were founded by organizers for organizers. NationBuilder was created with the belief that everyone can lead. Our founders set out with the goal of making the tools of leadership available at an affordable price to people all over the world. And as our platform has grown and developed over the past 10 years, we've provided this solution to countless political campaigns, candidates, nonprofits, corporations, higher ed, and associations. So we really are at the kind of intersection of technology and politics, technology and advocacy. When you're thinking about connecting with your community, our software is there to help that scale. And what does it look like to actually put people at the center of what you're trying to do as it relates to your organization and corporate advocacy in particular. So I'm going to kick it over to Stefan again to give us a little overview of what corporate advocacy is.
Sure, thanks, Saoirse. So corporate advocacy, right? What we see now in Brussels as a starting point is a far greater degree of politicization, as I mentioned in the introduction. So while public affairs of the more traditional sort remains absolutely essential, reputation and positioning can and will dictate policy outcomes. And that is more the case today than it was 5 years ago, and it'll be even more so the case in 5 years. So what we're seeing now is really an expansion of the toolkit to service reputation building and positioning, including in particular community building and mobilizing advocates and mobilizing supporters, which is really the focus of our work today. So our definition of corporate advocacy is really corporates, corporate entities, companies, trade associations, building communities of support in order to help them build public affairs programs and campaigns and advocate with success.
Awesome. So types of advocacy programs. We've got grassroots advocacy, right? This refers to efforts to engage your audience in advocacy on your organization's behalf. Legislative advocacy plays a very heavily right into these engagement, but there are a number of other tactics that can and should be deployed outside of legislative engagement. We then move into grass tops, right? So grass tops advocacy involves focusing narrowly on opinion leaders, elected official, high profile individuals to advocate on your organization's behalf. This tactic can go hand in hand with your grassroots efforts or be a standalone engagement for your specific initiatives. Lastly, employee advocacy, right? That is all about turning your employees into advocates on your behalf. You should absolutely provide information and opportunities for your employees to engage in your legislative advocacy, but you should take it a step further, right? By providing them with content to share alongside those efforts into their own specific networks. 5 key strategies that work, right? Technology that we have at our disposal today offers different opportunities that were just not available 10 years ago. And as the tools change, so have our specific strategies. Number 1, the first lesson is about data. More specifically about being smarter with the data you collect, not just collecting more of it. When we think about campaign teams that succeed, they know exactly why they need each data set that they're collecting and how invaluable it will be to the campaign. They make sense of that data that they have, analyze it, aggregate it to paint a more complete picture of the people behind their databases. The individuals behind their data matter most, whether that's a voter, a volunteer, or a potential stakeholder. For example, when you're able to turn a list of email addresses into a more complete profile of who your people actually are, it's going to be a game changer, right? You're better able to understand of who your advocates are, establish more meaningful relationships, and then see a more impactful action from the people that you are engaging with as a result. So one of the very first things that most candidates or political parties do when they're starting at NationBuilder is sync in that membership data, volunteer data, address information into a single database. And if you collect your information and don't take action based on what you find, you're actually not going to see results. So the value of data is the potential you have something meaningful to do with it, right? Hopefully that's actually also going to create real value to the end user, your end stakeholder. And so let's say you have 1.6 million people in your database, right? If you can't identify the top tier among those, the ones who are going to help drive awareness, create a movement or community, right? Then all you have is an extremely large email list with very little value, which brings us into our next point, which is finding your 5%, right? The top 5% of your database are what we refer to as your leaders or your advocates. You will need these leaders if you actually create an advocacy program in an organic and effective way. The same shift in public trust away from traditional institutions and toward new forms of leadership that we've seen in politics, we're actually now seeing in the corporate space, right? So, excuse me, the latest research by Nielsen actually shows that 92% of stakeholders are more likely to act based on a friend referral over your traditional marketing methods. This number is fascinating, right? Especially when we know how much money, time, and effort that most large-scale organizations put into all other forms of marketing. Very rarely does any budget go into word-of-mouth strategies and activities. The other research I like to bring up here is from Engage Sciences. This tells us that 4.7% of a typical company's base drives 100% of its word of mouth. The people who make up that 4.7% are already engaged with your organization, right? They're involved in your product, in your services, whatever your offering is. And they are the ones who will be able to spread that word of mouth to the remaining 95%. So think about putting in some money into activating that 5% to really drive a community engagement model. Excuse me. As an example, if we think back to that political infrastructure, what we're trying to learn from here as corporations and as brands, right? If a political campaign is out there knocking doors, they're not going to knock on 4 million of them. They're going to identify 5,000 of them that they know they can engage with and that they can either persuade or move to a particular cause or issue that they care about as the candidate. Those same tactics need to be applied when you're looking at it from a corporate lens for advocacy. Who are the 5% that you know you can move to get the needle where it needs to be? So how do we, now we found that 5%, we actually have to build a community. And one of the big questions that keeps most companies or organizations awake at night is, what do millennials want, right? Research has shown us that they actually want an authentic connection with organizations that they love and believe in. The coolness, right, of an organization is merely a byproduct of that connection. From a strategic perspective, the sweet spot is when we can tap into digital marketing and community building to make the best of both worlds. So again, looking back to that politician model, they've come to understand that great branding and a strong online presence, costly ads, etc., are no longer enough to get voters to engage, right? To take part in politics and ultimately vote. So to get the results they need, they have to build this sense of community and movement. For companies, marketing in 2020 is not just about pushing out your products, pushing out your services, etc. It's also about spreading ideas, right? Upholding values and creating a strong community. The ideas, the value, the mission at the core of your company, your organization, are what will actually allow your stakeholders to authentically connect with you. The importance of authenticity is even more relevant when you consider the latest stats around influencer marketing, right? So according to research by Check, a cybersecurity company, brands spend on influencer marketing is 8.5 billion in 2019, right? 8.5 billion, and is projected to increase this year. Simultaneously, the engagement from fake followers, right, on those sponsored posts is costing these brands about 1.3 billion a year. So when you're thinking about this influencer model, we're not saying that an influencer model is bad, but it's the relationship. It's the core relationship that you've built with the individual to amplify trust in who you are, not just paying someone to influence for your brand. It's about building that strong community and then empowering those leaders to actually engage their networks and disseminate your information. Number 4, privacy, the big one, right? One of NationBuilder's core tenets has always been that our customers own and can effectively manage their own data. As such, ensuring that stakeholders have control over what data they are sharing, how it will be used, who will have access to it, is extremely important to us. Gaining consent is the first step needed to build a strong relationship with your advocates. And we know that the world of data privacy is ever evolving, and we do ensure that our tools enable our customers to actually comply with GDPR and other global data regulations. We do believe that you can't build long-lasting communities without trust. And one way an organization can build trust with its users is through consent and very specific, clear paths of engagement, right? Leadership is about people. And at the end of the day, what matters most is how you treat the members of your community, your stakeholders, right? Your constituents, your potential advocates. To lead effectively, you need to know who wants to be in conversation with you and how they'd actually like that to happen. You have to understand what they care about and share what's relevant to them and be clear about the data you're collecting, why you need it, and how you're actually going to use it. Our last tip in this, personalization is key. So yes, this is probably fairly obvious, but it's worth mentioning because it's a tactic that many companies still seem to struggle with, right? Your stakeholders are smarter than they have ever been, and they expect a personalized experience from the website they're visiting to the email that you're sending them. To keep their attention though, everything must feel tailored and uniquely designed for them. The more personalized their experience, the happier and more likely they are going to engage with whatever your call to action is. So Infosys research has actually constantly proven, right, that there is a desire from people for better personalization. with 31% of people surveyed saying that they would like to see their shopping experience far more personalized than it currently is. In addition, 59% of shoppers who've experienced personalization believe it has a notable influence on their purchasing mechanism. So personalization is a must, right? When you're engaging in advocacy with your stakeholders, reflect back to them what they've done to support your organization and what you need them to do next. That's a key tactic to actually increasing the trust in your particular entity. Another important thing to remember is that if you want to have people advocate on your behalf, you need to make it real easy for them to do it, right? Use tools that allow you to make dynamic asks based on historical engagement. It's actually not just a nice to have anymore, but it's a necessity in order to engage with advocacy at a corporate level. So what does an advocacy campaign rollout look like? You have probably all experienced a moment when you needed or wanted to take a particular stand, whether this was in an effort to change public policy, create awareness, or advance an issue. In doing so, you have already engaged in the concept of advocacy, right? Every organization we meet at NationBuilder does have unique needs and objectives that are common threads in how they meet and exceed those goals, right? Whether you're a household name or you're just starting out, having a strategy in place to engage your advocates or turn people into advocates is vital, right? And as with most things, there are a number of different strategies that can be implemented to achieve your advocacy goals. I'm going to go through now a strategy that can be used to increase engagement with your overall brand and also develop an advocacy program that fits for your organization. So your core strategy here, right? Advocacy is the process by which corporations organize public support for a particular cause and influence decision-making that will affect change. Your top line strategy, and this is where I want to just kind of shout out to Steph and his crew, right? This is where you will work with your public affairs team to develop out these narratives and make sure that you have that strategy in place and the content is punchy and you can engage with audiences the way you need to, right? And in NationBuilder, when we're talking about this here, we're talking about your story. When we say story, we're talking about your story of your organization, right? Think about the achievements that your brand has made. Ensure that your story allows for people to self-identify with your entity in a way that will actually drive them to action, right? Your content, obviously this is encompassing of your logo, your photo, your video and marketing collateral, but this allows your stakeholders to easily identify, right? That one trigger moment where you can see that brand and you can then interact with it. It also allows you to build trust. Your online presence, right? When stakeholders are interacting with you online, they should be able to identify your initiatives and products with ease. That gives them the ability to share it and want to share that content because they have that trust. Your social media strategy, your email program, your website should all have a tone that allows folks to engage with you, excuse me, authentically. And lastly is your offline presence, right? I know that right now no one is thinking about their in-person engagement, but I just want to flag that the whole premise here is your offline presence should be amplified by your online engagement. So understand your people. What you're seeing here is a 360 view of an individual advocate, right? So on the left, we're seeing Lewis Morton. We can identify the data that he's actually shared with us as an organization. We can see the number of recruits. We can see that he's a local advocate, that he's in a particular household. We also have the Twitter information, right? This is all data that he has consented to give to us, and it allows us to paint this 360 image of who he is. On the other side, we're seeing Frances Carr, right? The relationships that she's actually made with other advocates in our database. It is really, really key to map out those relationships when you're thinking about an advocacy program, because you're going to be able to leverage Frances's relationships to move your initiative forward. Communicate with your folks, right? You're seeing right here this concept of everyone who signs up, wait a couple of days, send them an email. That goes back to this concept around your calls to action. So making sure that people have clear understanding of how they can actually engage with whatever your advocacy program is asking them to do. The other thing you're noticing here is the email stats, right? You really want to get an understanding for how your content is proving when it's within your advocate base. So are we seeing a higher open rate when you talk about a specific issue? Are you understanding that when you reflect data back to individuals, you get higher engagement on your calls to action, for example? Those are really important things to think about when you're communicating with your advocates. Grassroots advocacy. So an advocacy program that focuses on grassroots needs to allow for people to engage at a local level. It's vital that you have like clear actions for them to be involved with on your website, right? Make sure they're able to share how they have engaged with your organization. This is going to empower them to recruit friends and family into your grassroots program. When someone takes that first action though, it's key to put them on a particular journey for the other actions you actually want them to take. And this requires you to have a clear sense of what you want your advocates to do, and to actually be in communication with them and receive feedback, right? What do they want to do? Allow you to put people at the center of what your grassroots program is. Grass tops advocacy. It's not new, right? Stakeholder engagement, lobbying, legislative tracking have all been happening for decades. A lot of you will already be tracking legislative bills from the EU and within specific countries that could have an impact on your industry. And if you aren't, it is vital to start monitoring that legislation that could potentially impact your industry. Understanding which legislation is in process will enable you to actually activate your advocates when it's necessary. Grasstops advocacy will differ, right, from country to country, city to city, but you need to be able to have a holistic picture of your relevant leaders and how they can help advocate on behalf of your organization. So think about who are the opinion leaders, the elected officials, the community leaders that you need to either start to build a relationship with or foster the relationship you have. Once you've identified this list, assess which tactics, right, feel best to reach out to those folks. Some people in that list will be perfect for a letter to the editor. Others may actually be able to promote content on social media or in local and national news outlets. It's really key that you identify the tactics your grassroots advocates can use to add value to your overall advocacy efforts. Employee advocacy, again, right? So your employees are already on board with what you're doing. They are more likely and more willing and wanting to advocate on your behalf. Instead of just having them take action on a legislative advocacy campaign, cultivate them to actually help get your message and efforts out to a larger audience by building out a proper employee program for them to opt into. On the right, you're seeing this screenshot of the Telefonica O2 program, and they created volunteer opportunities within their employee organization. This is built out on NationBuilder. So you're seeing that this individual has, totaled up 18 hours in their volunteer contributions. It's not always about the ask with your employee engagement program. It's about how you're actually engaging with them and how you're, empowering them to lead and spread the message that you are. And that will reap the rewards of what does it mean to actually advocate on behalf of the entity I'm employed by. Pan-European. How's everyone doing? Everyone feeling good? We're at the 26-minute mark. Great, love it. I see some head nods. Cool. Okay, so Pan-European engagement. That's a map of the US. And it's important to flag this because there is this misconception out there that the US has figured this out, or that it's easier to do it in the US. We have 50 states here with 328.2 million people. California itself has 39 million people, whereas Vermont, right, has 600,000. Each state has its own legislating body that can be bipartisan in some. You can then look at your city council levels, your selectmen boards, right? It is a very complex infrastructure. They also have different cultures in each state and a multitude of languages. So when you think about a national advocacy campaign in the US, they are actually facing a lot of the same challenges that you are in Europe. And we know that right now, the need for grassroots advocacy programs are actually more important than ever. Your organization needs people who are invested, right, in the work that you're doing, but with a specific lens on how it's actually impacting their community locally. So I want to give you an example of what this actually looks like in the US right now. This is a customer of mine that I've worked with for many, many years at this point. And this is their homepage, their website, when you come to their particular advocacy program. And what you're immediately being reflected with is the diversity among the 50 states, the national program that they're running for advocacy. I'm also being hit immediately with this personalization, right? You see right here, it says social, welcome to exchange. That level of personalization allows me to feel like I'm a part of a community. That's what you are striving for, right? You want people to feel like they are connected to what you are doing so that they're actually going to engage on your behalf. Now we have an extremely fun map here of Europe, and where you can see are the plots of the hosts for today. So we've got Stefan over there in Denmark, and we've got Chris in the UK, and myself in Ireland. And what I want you to think about here is, yes, you're going to need that multi-language content when you're engaging at a pan-European level. But your issues are going to vary by country, right? Maybe it will impact you in Germany different than it will impact you in France. That is something that you are going to need to think about as in a holistic view set of how can my employees, maybe if you have employees all across Europe, how can they interact on that specific country by country level? Same thing with your grass tops, your stakeholders that you want to be engaging with. And lastly, build an ambassador program. An ambassador program will allow you to kind of cross country lines and engage with people in a more connective way. So think about peer-to-peer, think about allowing and empowering your people to actually recruit individuals into your organization and create that holistic approach. The last thing I'm going to chat with y'all about today is the role of crisis communications and what it actually has in all of this. So right now we are currently obviously experiencing a global crisis, and we're seeing organizations all over the world lean on their communities to advocate for people who need help and receive and give help to those who need it. So in thinking about everything we've just talked about over the last half an hour, that's long term, right? Like that allows you to plan for it, to map it out, identify your stakeholders, create employee engagement programs, find your top 5%, implement your consents, etc. But there are moments in every industry, in every organization, where a crisis hits and you need to interact with it in a specific way. So be ready, right, to launch a brand website for a specific engagement when a crisis hits. In politics, a crisis situation can take many forms, right? So think of a snap election, an unforeseen referendum, an actual PR crisis surrounding a specific campaign, right? Take Theresa May's bid for Prime Minister in 2016, right? The then Prime Minister David Cameron announced he was stepping down after the results of the Brexit referendum. And Theresa May announced she was stepping up. In less than 36 hours, her whole campaign infrastructure was up and running, right? And one of the most strategic things that she did was to use an off-the-shelf template. When we talk about templates, I'm talking about the look and feel of your website. And so this is, not only could she be the first one to actually announce, she could also be the first to have a functioning action hub for her grassroots supporters where they could share content on social media, sign up, etc. So the best thing you can do as an organization is to be ready with a dark site that you can actually make public when crisis calls for it. And I'm noting here it is worth actually defining what a dark site is. So more often than not, a dark site is a pre-built landing page or a microsite designed specifically to be used in the event of a crisis. It should be easy to spin up and to activate and ready to use at a moment's notice. I will state such sites can be expensive if you are going to keep them constantly updated. This is why we want to think about having a pre-templated thing that you can pop up as soon as a crisis arises. Transparency, right? It's a good thing. Keeping a high level of transparency is vital in a crisis as it allows you to build trust, deep trust with those people. Remaining open and communicative with your audiences at large is going to help you maintain the key relationships that often take years of hard work to build and can disappear in an instant, especially during a crisis. And lastly, leverage your advocates, right? Some of your best resources during a crisis are your employees and those external stakeholders that we talked about. These are the people who actually believe in what you're doing and want to see you succeed. It's important to remember that calling upon your community or advocates in a time of crisis will only succeed if you've actually built that strong relationship with them prior to a crisis taking place. With that said, that is the end of my content, and I'm going to kick it over to Stefan and Chris to actually dive into a fireside chat.
Thanks so much, Sosha. So Chris, one of the main things I hear about in Brussels when talking to corporate players, be it companies or trade associations, about this type of stuff is, you know, we're not an NGO, we're not a political campaign. Our issues are highly nuanced. Perhaps we're on the wrong side of the public debate. Does this sort of stuff remain relevant?
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I think that speaks directly to John's question in the chat there, and I guess I think the makeup of this group is quite heavy in public affairs functions, either in associations or companies directly, and I would say that essentially is like a political thing, like to have a public affairs function itself. So if you have a public affairs function, you're going to be able to take action on kind of one of three levels that I see it. Like no matter what, at least you have one of these levels. You probably have all three. So I just want to go through these three levels that I see a lot in my work in Europe and beyond, and give some actual specific examples of this. So closest to home, obviously, is as Saoirse said, the kind of Brussels-based stakeholder industry engagement. And there's a big opportunity just to modernize and build real relationships if you don't have technology, behind that. If it's just on spreadsheets or, if you're kind of using old systems or no systems to actually track and build those relationships, because even at that scale, it takes work to kind of keep those relationships ongoing. So an example of this is, I can't say the names of NDAs and things, but it's one of the top 5 fintech companies in Europe who have been really successful about lobbying for like payment fee legislation in the EU. And that goes to our second level of work, which is the national level. So obviously a lot of these issues bubble up from individual nation states. So in that use case, that company is also doing work in the UK, in London, in DC, in Australia, like in the kind of major capitals of the world, trying to kind of standardize this legislative advocacy process, and they're using NationBuilder to kind of centralize those stakeholders across the world who are interested in this, and slowly bring in their consumers who are interested in taking advocacy actions as well. Another really interesting example, not on NationBuilder, that I've seen recently at the national level was Oatly, the oat milk brand, petition to the German Bundestag about CO2 labeling law in Germany. So it's a very successful petition. It was on the homepage in Germany, and that may have already, I haven't tracked that law particularly myself because I'm not an oat milk company or a food company, but that may bubble up into kind of EU law. I could see that definitely happening from the national level up. And then the third level is like down another level into what I call like the hyper local level, where I think this type of community engagement is, for most companies and associations and industries, already happening on the ground, but it's not connected to the national level, let alone the EU level, which is obviously a big problem. There's like the disconnect between the EU and what's happening on the ground. And if you as a company or an association can take those local stories and bring them up into kind of the EU decision-making and the storytelling and the public affairs work that you're doing, that obviously would have massive impact. And the type of things are almost endless what people are doing here. So for example, we have a company called Novozymes, which is a European company, but their US office was already doing university partnerships and events in the US, where they were engaging students with their like bioenzyme products and kind of what their impact was in the world, and in their local facilities, especially like around the universities around their facilities. And so they just use NationBuilder to make a better digital presence, do event RSVPs better, collect those people in one place. So that's one normal use case. And then you have somebody like Apex Wind Energy, like an energy company with wind farms, who built local communities around each wind farm so that people could kind of understand who the employees were and what was going on in their local areas. So I would challenge, like, any company, any industry has factories or local facilities, and even if they don't have those national issues or EU level issues, which I think most companies also have those two levels. So I would challenge everyone to kind of think about those three levels and see if there is a program you could start. And I guess my question to you then, Steph, kind of you said a little bit at the beginning, is like, has that kind of Brussels level advancement started with the stakeholder engagement. Like, how does Brussels do this right now? And like, as a Brussels public affairs agency, kind of where does this land right now in your work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've definitely seen a shift. There's definitely been change. I think Brussels has always been a policy buff's wet dream, you know, all about the technicalities and the process. And that stuff still matters 100%, absolutely. Brussels is more political now. You know, we deal with issues like climate rather than obscure technical standards. The parliament here is more powerful, more activist. The Commission strives for legitimacy, so wants to reflect public sentiment, even though it's in theory mainly apolitical. Member states are more engaged, and this has all resulted in organizations investing more heavily in reputation building and communications. So what we're seeing is, we are seeing a lot more communications work in general, a lot more senior communications folk, and we're seeing big, really ambitious, expensive campaigns in Brussels and also member states that are aimed at building reputation of companies and whole industries in some cases. And I think this is all great. I mean, it's a really positive shift. Where I see less movement, admittedly, is in what we're talking about today, identifying, mobilizing supporters. You know, we're seeing a lot of pumping out messages across multiple channels. An awful, big ad spends, big media spends, etc., big things on billboards. But we live in an age of cynicism, and I doubt much of it will stick, to be honest, especially if the stuff's being pushed by industries or companies that aren't particularly popular. Having said that, I do know of some Brussels organizations that do targeted community building and advocacy. And I stress, though, this touches upon what we were talking about before. Community building doesn't have to be about massive communities across multiple countries and getting them all to lobby on your behalf. You know, this is really, really scalable. And the example I'd like to cite is actually a client, a lovely coalition that's building a community of experts in their field and harnessing this community to develop a rating scheme, which they hope will become a European standard. So again, they're not building a huge community of people hoping that they will send dozens of letters to their legislators, even though that is an element of what we're talking about. In their case, what they're trying to do is build a community of experts that will use their expertise to help them develop a standard. And yeah, sorry, one last point I'd make in relation to that is also just the integrated nature of it, and Zorsha touched upon that before. So this doesn't just happen in the digital space. You know, we're using technology such as yours to build these communities, but then a lot of times these communities then meet in the offline world. So, you know, with this coalition that I'm talking about before, you know, they're identified and they're convened online, but then at the end of the year, hopefully if we're out of this mess, you know, they all get together and spend a day and thrash out the rating scheme. Back to you, Chris. We touched upon organizations that perhaps aren't on the right side of the public debate. So I think a big question a lot of participants will probably have is, you know, say if you're the oil and gas industry, for instance, or chemicals or pharma, etc. You know, who are their advocates, and what should they actually do? I mean, isn't this really difficult if you're not on the right side of the public debate?
Yeah, so touched on it a little bit, but I think it's a really important question, because like it's obviously easier to do this if your issue is public friendly and like very understood and like consumer based. And so obviously kind of like that's the kind of challenge that, you know, obviously NGOs do this, obviously political campaigns do this because like that is their specific work, and it's easier to do that if it's just a naturally understandable thing. But I think that means it's actually more important for industries that like have more nuance and less media friendly issues to build community and strong relationships with the people who do care about your issue. And kind of back to John's question about like companies are expected not to be political. I actually think that like yes, not political, but companies are expected to have a purpose in the world and like advocate for something and be building something and bringing something into the world and have a reason to do that. And even if it's, so a lot of that time in those industries that are again more nuanced and less public friendly, I think industry outsiders often miss that, like, and underestimate the impact that those industries and those companies are actually having on people's lives. So, you think about the simple things right now that we're going through in this crisis, like massive societal changes in employment, right? And the type of impact that like when big companies are impacted in industries that like we don't see as part of our daily life, like we're not jumping in an Uber, we're not jumping in, Airbnbs. It's like more of like what makes the world tick. What are the supply chains that bring food into your supermarket? Like these unsexy things that like become really important when you see how the world works. I think just people who are outside of that industry and aren't in the Brussels kind of space, maybe, or in the industry space, they underestimate that impact and how many people. Some of these companies have hundreds of thousands of people working and millions across Europe working in those industries. So I think kind of understanding that everyone has that impact, even if it doesn't have that issue, there's at least the employees in that industry of employing people around the products or whatever you're bringing into the world. So once you realize it's possible to do something, then of course it's about designing your campaign to fit the right audience, as Sorcha was going through. So, if it's an energy company, like Sorcha showed the exchange Exxon example there, and it's kind of a large scale kind of campaign reaching across many areas, but maybe it's how energy companies are leading or doing work on the green transition and what they're doing to kind of move things forward, which we've seen quite a lot of in the industry. But maybe it's not even issue based. Maybe it's just based on the employee engagement and like how important it is to keep this factory full and ticking over for the local community in this group. Or kind of back to that kind of hyper local level, maybe it's something really, really simple, like not even national based. Like we have a hospital that we need to build, but we have lots of not in my backyard people who don't want that hospital built because it will cause traffic in their area, right? That happens, and to big healthcare companies, and you need to build those local relationships to do that, and you need to use technology to do that. So I guess my big point is like it's very easy once you identify and understand that you have that power to do something, to choose one of these things and just go for it and pilot it, and it can then scale if it's successful. But like there's always something to do in this space, whether it's local, national. And so I guess my last question to you is like, in those different levels, is like, we don't do messaging, like we don't do full campaign planning. It's obviously, I think, more the role of Ruud Peterson and firms like yours. So like, how does it actually work kind of on the messaging and like campaign execution side of things on your end? And then we can go to questions after that.
Sure, absolutely. No, I'll keep this relatively brief. I mean, I think what we do, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, what we do is really we help organizations figure out what the scope and the scale of this might be. So, what type of community could potentially benefit you? What's the message to attract them? What would incentivize them to action? And what actions could they actually perform? But I'd stress again, I said this before, and you both repeated this. This isn't about spraying and praying and hoping that someone out there will support you. It's about figuring out what type of community could help. I'd stress, this is really, really scalable. One quite famous case study in Brussels, it wasn't one I worked on, is of an agrochemicals company a few years ago that ran a campaign in a single land in Germany to build a network of supporters from the farming community, because they calculated that to win in Brussels they needed Germany, and to win in Germany they just needed the one rather large land. So rather than go out there and lobby all over Europe, they kept it really, really, really narrow, and they won. So that's really what we would look to do. Where do you get most bang for your buck? And again, I would stress, it's not necessarily about getting a community to lobby. It's about getting a community to do something that is useful to you. So the aforementioned example of helping, building a community of experts to build or put together a rating scheme, which you want to be an EU standard. So again, that is a form of advocacy. I think that's it on my part. Shall we shift to questions?
Yes, please. And folks, please, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or also just pop it in the chat. We are here. And I know we have two. One, I think Chris answered, but John, if you want any clarifying comments on that, let us know. And then Frederick's question: how do you identify potential grasstops advocates in a country where you currently have no activity? There's a number of ways you can do that. Stefan, Chris, please jump in here. But understanding, again, to Stefan's point there around Germany, right? Understanding specifically what the thing you are trying to do is, and then researching the specific individuals, whether that would be a local elected official, whether that would be a news outlet that you need to engage with, a particular body of people, farmers as an example. Research will be the predominant component to where you have no activity, if you need to have activity in that space. But Stefan, Chris, please jump in.
I mean, the one point I would make to this is the very first time I sat down with NationBuilder a few years ago, I remember the one question I did ask you guys was, how long does it take to put together your initial list of advocates? And I was surprised. I think you said, 6 to 12 months or something. So I think, the sad truth is that this isn't, there isn't a magic trick. It is in large part a manual process. It is knowing who to look for. I mean, certainly, you can campaign and put out highly targeted social ads, targeting very, very specific communities and urging them to come to your website and sign up, et cetera, et cetera. That certainly should be a part of it. But the example I spoke about before, the coalition and the rating scheme, the approach was there, the organization involved knew who the key stakeholders were, or the key organizations were, certainly. And it's about going out and asking them, who should be part of our community. And that's a bloody long time. But yeah, no real shortcuts, I'm afraid.
So I guess one thing that the question reminds me of, I hope it answers it a little bit, is the possibility of creating this, we maybe haven't called it out enough, creating this infrastructure for advocacy kind of separate to the kind of tools of sales and marketing and product kind of delivery into the world that you probably already have, as if you are a company directly. Obviously, if you're an industry association, maybe you also have membership tools to kind of operate your business, but do you have the kind of community tools you need to operate? So kind of shifting that 5% from maybe a marketing database you have, which is to sell your product or kind of get something else into the world, finding those people, maybe you don't have staff on the ground in that region, but maybe you have consumers or some people, moving that into kind of an advocacy motion that is completely different to kind of a marketing and sales conversion motion, and treating those people as such and developing those as advocacy relationships compared to other types of marketing relationships. It's a completely different level. And what we kind of encourage kind of people to have a community organizing mindset as a public affairs team, to kind of communicate with people in a different, as Saoirse said, more personalized ways. And you need the kind of tool set separately to do that in most cases. Most kind of public affairs teams don't have that kind of ability to go in and use the marketing tool set to kind of build those relationships, especially if you're not on the ground in that area.
Either we did a fantastic job explaining this and you have no questions whatsoever, or you're being shy. So please jump in with questions.
Cool. I mean, maybe if I could just add a point to John's question, which I think Chris has already referred to. Political parties are supposed to drive movements, so advocacy groups, private companies are not expected to be political. Again, I think that harks back to how ambitious do we really want to be with our advocacy? The point I've made repeatedly is scalability. ideally you're not doing this at a massive scale. You're not using advocacy to build a giant movement, although perhaps you are. It's really about, well, how can it best help you achieve your public affairs goals? And that might be building a community of 100 people, might be 50 people. So again, this isn't about building a movement. It's about doing something that will help support your public affairs goals, whether it's convening a bunch of experts or indeed getting people to lobby on your behalf in a single location. But maybe just one other point I would stress is this it's just the choice, really. To some extent, I mean, I went to the US last year, and I went to an actual event on advocacy, and I remember one thing that really struck me was that a lot of people said, as corporates, we've actually got to do this. We've got to go indirectly, because increasingly we're going to Congress and people won't meet with us because we're lobbyists, because we represent corporate interests directly. We're hearing that in Brussels a little bit as well with the Commission. If you're a corporate entity and you're unpopular, sometimes you won't get those meetings. So I think increasingly, certainly over the next 5-10 years, we're gonna have to do this. This isn't a nice to have.
Yeah. Could you comment on any possible contradiction between privacy and personalization? I can speak to that specifically from a NationBuilder toolset lens. So the data that you'll have on an individual is data that they have consented to give to you. And what our tools will enable you to do is to reflect that data back to them. So contradiction between privacy and personalization, you're using data that they've consented for you to have, and then rendering it to them to drive and increase engagement. I think the key thing to note with this is we've seen it work, right? So we've actually seen that people who receive a personalized content or a personalized call to action, they have, I think it's actually a 70% higher engagement rate with those call to actions than an individual who receives a blanket message which says, contact your legislator today, as opposed to saying, your legislator is X, contact them about Y, because you have done A, B, C in the past. I hope that answers that question. Okay, so public affairs people know that campaigning and lobbying is a job that requires patience and includes frustration. How do you keep your advocates engaged and especially active in the long term and make them feel that what they do, often sharing some of their spare time, actually have or will have an impact? Stefan, Chris?
I can make I think one comment here, and again, this I feel like a broken record. I'm saying this again. When you're building your community, you're ideally looking for people who, for a very narrow set of people who are really, really, really bloody committed. So I think the easy answer here is, yeah, sure, it's, maybe you will struggle to keep them engaged and interested in the long term, but your assumption is that, they're really committed to your cause, hence why they are advocates. I think the most obvious example of this, certainly in the corporate world, is the pharma industry. And their key advocates are patients and patient groups, and they're inherently going to be incredibly loyal because obviously because of their personal circumstances or the circumstances of the people they care about. So again, if you identify your advocates right and you identify a narrow set of them, they should stay inherently loyal. But I think John raises a great follow-up question. Do you have any thoughts on gamification? Guys, you probably know more about this than I do. I do know of an example of a biotech company that uses gamification to essentially add an element of competition between both its public affairs staff and its advocates, and apparently it works incredibly well. I don't know, I find it I'm slightly uncomfortable with it, but it certainly does hit some nerve in the human brain, and it has been proven to work. You might want to look at what sort of demographic it works with. Maybe it's testosterone fueled fellas in their 20s, but hey.
That's brilliant. Just one thing on that Simone question, it's about what your designation for that individual advocate is. So yes, you're not going to constantly have calls to action and drives to impact them, but switch your content. Maybe it's an educational component of content. You're informing them about the industry. Also keep your cadence regular. So it's a monthly engagement with them versus a weekly, right? And you can then activate in times of need or in times of crisis when you need to engage with them, but you should keep that relationship throughout the year, even if you only have a 1 month long campaign. There's a bunch of stuff on gamification, but Chris, please jump in.
Yeah, so Simone, like to me, like your question is all about trust. Like, how do you keep people engaged in the long term? It's about building trust, like with some of that like personalization, if you can. I think you can all think about the email programs that the organizations you get emails from that you don't open, and the ones that you do. And the ones that you do are because it seems like you're part of that organization. You've built trust. You want to hear what they're saying, and so that's the whole point of using technology to enable you to be more personalized and appropriate to what people have done with you in the past. And the more you can do that, the better you can get at that, the more people are going to stay engaged for the long term. And I think that goes nicely into John's question about gamification. It's like, to me, that speaks to kind of the first thing people might see, which is like website design. Like if you're lucky enough to get someone to click your ad or to click a friend's post about the issue and get them to come back to an action-based website, you better have something for them to do. And even better, if they do that action, like, can they start to see how they're part of your organization immediately? Can they see the next step, the next action chain? Like, is there a leaderboard they can see? And like, you know, to me, that's all about like visual design. It's often the first thing that we talk to with our customers is like, what kind of like web, like conversion action pages do we need to create on NationBuilder, with often consulting and designers involved to like capture the attention of people. And those are all the strategies that you kind of work through. But like, if you get someone to your site and like there's nothing for them to do and like there's no kind of psychology behind it, then yeah, you're going to lose them from the beginning and not even have the chance to build that relationship of trust that you do when they're on your email, you know, program going forward.
Yeah. Just one thing to flag in that I've actually seen work pretty well is this concept of highlighting an advocate. So in a monthly newsletter, basically highlighting, it works really well with employee engagement, but highlighting that this particular person is, you know, the advocate of the month. And you can do that. There's, you know, in NationBuilder, you can use the concept of social capital, which is basically a virtual currency where people can accrue these points based on the actions they take. And you can then render and highlight individuals. It's a great way to reflect back. One, you're promoting this individual for what they've done, and two, how other folks can get involved. Okay, we are at time. This was so fantastic to be in it with you. Morning my time, afternoon your time. We will get the recording out to everyone. And if you do have any questions, obviously feel free to reach out to myself and Stefan and Chris. And thank you for spending an hour with us today. Anything to add, Chris, Stefan?
Thanks so much, everyone. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or any other ways. We'll send the follow-up info to the list. And yeah, looking forward to hopefully seeing some of you in Brussels at some point and beyond when we can travel again. So stay safe and healthy, everyone. Thanks a lot.